The Lee Enfield slipped from the shooter's grip before he'd even taken his stance. 23-year-old Aaron Fitch caught it an inch from the concrete, his face going the color of a hot ember. Around him, the other competitors looked away with the careful politeness that competitive shooters offer to public embarrassment. The morning air at the Rideau Valley Rifle Association range smelled of Hoppy's No. 9 and fresh dew, and the range officer's clipboard was already moving on to the next name on the list. That's when Aaron noticed the old man on the bench. He was sitting the way old men sit when they've decided the world owes them stillness, shoulders relaxed, hands resting on his knees, eyes moving slowly across the firing line with an expression that was difficult to name. Not bored, not critical. Something closer to grief maybe, or the look of someone watching a river that used to run wider. He wore a faded green canvas jacket, the kind sold at army surplus stores, though this one had the particular softness of something worn for 30 years before it ever reached a shelf. His hair was entirely white, and so was the close-trimmed beard across his jaw. He hadn't signed in at the registration table. He hadn't claimed a lane. He'd simply appeared in the early morning, taken a seat on the weathered equipment bench near the south end of the range, and become part of the furniture. Nobody knew who he was, nobody asked. The Rideau Valley Invitational drew competitors from across Ontario and Quebec, serious shooters, the kind who drove 6 hours on a Saturday to compete for no prize money and a modest trophy, who spent more on optics than most people spent on furniture. They arrived with hard-sided cases and spotting scopes and small notebooks where they tracked wind conditions and ambient temperature by the quarter hour. They wore matching team shirts and spoke in the clipped shorthand of people who considered themselves professionals, even in a hobby. The rangemaster, a stocky man in his early 50s named Ted Birchall, had organized this competition for 11 years and prided himself on running a tight operation. When one of his volunteers mentioned the old man on the bench, Ted glanced over, registered the green jacket and white hair, decided the man looked harmless, and went back to his clipboard. Probably ex-military, he said. They like to come out and watch. Just make sure he stays behind the yellow line. That was the extent of the attention paid to Duncan Laird for the first 90 minutes of the competition. Duncan himself did not seem to mind. He watched the shooters cycle through their warm-up relays with the same patient focus he had once used to watch apprentices at the Canadian Army Small Arms Coaching School. Noting habits, cataloguing errors, saying nothing. His hands were still on his knees. His breathing was slow and even. He had not planned to come today. He'd been visiting his sister in Carleton Place for the weekend, and he'd driven past the range on his way to buy groceries, and something had pulled at him the way ranges always did. Even now, even at 76, even with both knees aching in the October cold, he'd pulled into the lot without fully deciding to. He'd sat on the bench without asking permission. He was not there to compete. He had not competed since 2009 at the Bisley Cup in Alberta, where he'd quietly won the senior category and left before the trophy presentation because he had a flight to catch. He was there the way some men visit places they once loved. Not to reclaim them, but to remember that they had once existed. He was still sitting there, still watching, when Aaron Fitch walked over. Aaron had come to the competition with his training partner, Matt Colville, a 25-year-old who had recently taken second place in a provincial 3-gun match and had not stopped mentioning it. They were both good shooters, genuinely good, with solid fundamentals and recent results to prove it. They were also the kind of good that hasn't yet encountered anything better, which is a particular kind of confidence that sits just on the wrong side of humility. Aaron had noticed the old man the way you notice weather, as a background detail with no bearing on the main event. But when Ted Birchall's equipment volunteer set aside a retired club rifle, a battered Lee Enfield No. 4 that had been misfiring in dry fire tests all morning, and placed it on the reject table 6 feet from where Duncan was sitting, Aaron got an idea that he thought was funny. He picked up the Lee Enfield. He and Matt exchanged a look. They walked over. "Hey there," Aaron said, addressing the old man with the particular cheerfulness of someone who has already decided the interaction will be entertaining. "You look like you might know your way around one of these. Mind taking a look? The thing's been giving us grief all morning. We've got a tournament to run and nobody's got time to mess with it." He held the rifle out. Matt was already suppressing a grin. The Lee Enfield was a relic, chambered in .303 British, 60+ years old, with a bolt that caught halfway and an ejector that had been bent out of spec. It had been pulled from surface rotation for a reason. Handing it to the old man on the bench was, in Aaron's estimation, a harmless bit of fun. What was the old guy going to do with it? Duncan Laird looked at the rifle for a moment. Then he took it. He didn't say anything. He didn't ask what was wrong with it. He simply took it in both hands and held it for 2 seconds. Just held it, the way a doctor holds a wrist before finding the pulse. And then he sat down on the bench and placed it across his lap and began to work. Aaron and Matt took a few steps back toward the firing line. They weren't watching directly. They were watching the way people watch something they expect to fail. Out of the corner of the eye, waiting. What happened instead was that a small crowd began to form. It started with one nearby competitor who glanced over, then stopped cleaning his own rifle and simply watched. Then another. Then the range officer, Constance Webb, who had been managing the firing line for a decade and had very good instincts, noticed the quality of silence gathering around the equipment bench and turned to look. Duncan's hands moved with a precision that seemed to belong to a different speed of time than everything else on the range. There was nothing showy about it. His fingers found the bolt first, reading the catch with his thumb the way you read a word you've read 10,000 times. Instantly, without sounding it out, he pressed the release, felt the resistance pattern, identified the problem in approximately 4 seconds. Then he moved to the trigger group. He did not ask for tools. He did not look up. He field-stripped the rifle in a sequence so clean and economical it looked like a demonstration, each component arriving on the bench beside him in a specific order, placed with the precision of surgical instruments on a tray. The bent ejector, the fouled trigger assembly, the firing pin, which someone had incorrectly reassembled after what appeared to be an amateur disassembly attempt, leaving a stress point that would cause half the strikes to misfire. Around him, the competition had largely stopped. Constance Webb took 2 steps closer without realizing she'd moved. Ted Birchall appeared from somewhere near the scoring table and stood with his arms crossed. Even Aaron and Matt had drifted back, their joking posture slowly replaced by something else, a dawning awareness that this was not going the way they'd imagined. 1 minute had passed. Duncan's hands were into the reassembly now, working in reverse with the same absent fluency. The firing pin went back correctly, not just placed but seated, the tension tested between his thumb and forefinger with a micro-adjustment so slight it was nearly invisible. The trigger group slid home. The bolt assembly followed. His fingers pressed and released and pressed again, checking resistance at each stage, making adjustments that would have required a gunsmith's bench for anyone else, but that his hands had long since memorized as intimately as a signature. At the 90-second mark, he began checking the action. Aaron had gone completely still. Matt's grin had dissolved sometime in the last minute and had not come back. The two of them stood watching, and they had stopped pretending not to. At 2 minutes flat, Duncan Laird stood up. He carried the Lee Enfield to the nearest empty firing lane, one of the bench rest positions at the far left of the line, and Constance started to say something about relay order, and then stopped herself. Something in the way he moved made the correction feel unnecessary. He loaded a single round. He did not adjust his stance, did not check his cheek weld, did not appear to deliberate in any visible way. He simply settled into position the way water settles into a vessel, completely without effort, and fired. 200 yards downrange, the paper target registered a hit dead center. He worked the bolt, loaded another round, fired. 5 shots, 5 rounds that could be covered with a 50-cent coin. The range was so quiet that the brass casing sounded loud against the concrete. Duncan engaged the safety, set the rifle down on the bench, and walked back to where Aaron and Matt were standing. He looked at Aaron, not with anger, not with satisfaction, and placed the rifle carefully into the younger man's hands. Then he turned and walked back to his bench. It was Ted Birchall who stepped forward. His face had the particular pallor of a man who suspects he has made a significant mistake without yet knowing its dimensions. "Excuse me, sir." His voice came out quieter than he'd intended. "I apologize for not introducing myself earlier. I run this competition. Could I ask your name?" The old man paused. He turned, unhurried, When he spoke, his voice was the voice of someone who chose words the way he'd once chosen shots, one at a time, no extras. Duncan Laird. The name settled over the range like a weather change. To Aaron and Matt, it meant nothing. To Constance Webb, who had 20 years in the sport and a father who'd served, it meant something she couldn't quite place but felt at the edge of, the way you feel a word that won't come. But from the back of the crowd, near the equipment table, a grey-haired competitor named Gordon, shooting in the senior division, a retired sergeant who'd spent 18 years in the Canadian Forces, said the name back under his breath like he was trying to confirm what he'd heard. Duncan Laird. A pause. Then louder, to no one in particular, Chief Warrant Officer Duncan Laird. If you've never heard that name, you're not alone. Most people outside military circles haven't. But watch what it did to the people on that range who had. The title moved through the crowd like a current finding ground. Ted's clipboard came down to his side. His mouth stopped working properly. Constance Webb closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, the way people do when they're absorbing something. Chief Warrant Officer Duncan Laird, 31 years in the Canadian Forces, former lead marksmanship instructor at the Canadian Army Small Arms Coaching School, the same school whose graduates went on to train snipers for 3 NATO allies. Author of Precision Marksmanship Fundamentals, the manual that had been required reading for every Canadian Forces marksman for over 2 decades, the one that was still cited in training doctrine from Halifax to Cold Lake. The man who held the record for longest confirmed shot fired in an operational context by a member of the Canadian Forces, a record set in 1997 during a classified peacekeeping advisory role that was still not fully declassified. The man awarded the Meritorious Service Medal twice, once for his instructional contributions and once for something whose citation described only as extraordinary service under conditions of extreme risk. The man who at 62 had walked away from the game entirely and gone home to Carlton Place to tend his garden. Gordon, the retired sergeant, crossed to where Duncan was standing and offered his hand with the deliberate precision of a formal gesture. The kind of handshake that carries rank history in its grip. "Sir," he said, "I trained under Warrant Pelletier in 2001. He told us that everything he knew he'd learned from you. I've been reading your manual since I was a private. It's an honour to meet you." Duncan shook his hand. "Tell Pelletier I said hello." Gordon almost smiled. "He retired 3 years ago, sir. He'd want to know you were here." The 2 young shooters who had handed Duncan the broken Lee Enfield as a joke were standing 6 feet away. Aaron's face had moved through several colours since the name was spoken. He looked at this particular moment like someone who has just realised that the quiet man they dismissed at a dinner party was the author of every book on the shelf. He stepped forward. His voice was careful with itself. "Sir." He stopped. Started again. "We didn't know who you were. We thought we were being." He stopped a second time because finishing that sentence honestly was harder than starting it. "There's no excuse for it. I'm sorry." Matt Colville said nothing but stepped forward as well, which counted for something. Duncan looked at them both for a moment, the long, unhurried look of someone who has measured men under conditions that made this kind of character assessment seem very low stakes. "How long have you been shooting?" he asked Aaron. 6 years competition, about 3. You've got a consistent problem with your trigger press on the follow-through. You're anticipating the break. It's costing you about 2 inches at 200 meters. He said it the way you tell someone their shoelace is untied. Not unkind, just true. The stance is solid. The grip pressure is good. It's the trigger. Aaron blinked. "You could see that from over there?" "I could see it from the parking lot," Duncan said. "It wasn't the rifle." Ted Birchall had been gathering himself during this exchange. He cleared his throat. "Chief Warrant Officer Laird." The title came out of him like an offering he'd only just realised he had to give. "It would mean a great deal to everyone here if you would consider competing today. We could arrange a senior category, or—" "I'll shoot in the open division," Duncan said. "Same rules as everyone else." Ted opened his mouth, closed it, nodded. "Of course, we'll get you registered." What followed over the next 2.5 hours became the kind of afternoon that gets written up in club newsletters and described in range conversations across the country for years afterward. Duncan Laird shot the competition with the Lee Enfield he'd repaired, refused the club's offer of a modern service rifle, declined the custom ammunition Ted's volunteer pressed on him. He shot standard ball ammunition through 60-year-old iron sights in the October wind on a range he'd never visited before that morning. His scores were not merely good. In a competition built around precision, where a quarter-inch variance at distance represented the edge between placements, his groups were an education. The shooters watching from adjacent lanes stopped treating it as a competition after the second relay. They started treating it as a clinic. At the longer distances, positions where the wind was most unpredictable and where the other competitors were managing respectable but workmanlike groups, Duncan simply read the conditions. A brief pause, a fractional adjustment, and the results spoke. There was no drama in how he did it. That was what stayed with people afterward. The absence of visible effort. By the final relay, there was no longer any meaningful contest for first place. The other competitors knew it. They weren't disappointed, exactly. They were watching the way you watch a craftsman who has spent a lifetime at his trade, not to measure yourself against it, but to see what the ceiling looks like. When the final scores were announced and Duncan's name was read first, the applause from the assembled range, competitors, volunteers, officials, was the sustained, unreserved kind that doesn't require orchestrating. Duncan accepted the trophy with a small nod and immediately looked for the nearest empty surface to set it down on. While Ted was organizing the award photographs, Gordon appeared at Duncan's elbow, his phone in hand. "I hope you don't mind, sir. I sent a message to a few people when I recognized your name. Someone apparently called CFB Petawawa. There may be people on their way." Duncan looked at him steadily. "You didn't need to do that." "No, sir, I didn't." 20 minutes later, a vehicle pulled into the range lot, not a staff car, not anything ceremonial, just a truck with a Forces Base sticker on the windshield. The man who climbed out was perhaps 45. With the particular economy of movement common to people who'd spent decades staying alert in the field. He wore civilian clothes, but he carried himself in the way that civilian clothes can't quite cover. Master Warrant Officer Keith Harbour, currently Senior NCO at the Petawawa Training Wing, formerly of the Canadian Rangers Advisory Program, walked across the range to where Duncan was standing and stopped at what was very nearly the position of attention. "Chief Warrant Laird." His voice was level, but something underneath it wasn't. "I was in your last course, November 2007. You probably don't remember me. There were 18 of us." Duncan looked at him. "You were pulling the barrel every time you loaded. Muscle memory from a previous rifle. We spent a week breaking it." Harbour almost smiled. "Yes, sir. 3 years ago, during an advisory rotation in Mali, that week saved my life. A stoppage, 4 seconds of cover. My hands knew what to do before I did." He paused. "I never got to tell you that. I'm glad I'm here." Duncan was quiet for a moment. Around them, the range had gone still in that respectful way that happens when people sense they're witnessing something that doesn't belong to them. "You cleared the stoppage," Duncan said. "I gave you the hours. The rest was yours." Harbour nodded. He extended his hand. "Still, thank you, sir." Aaron and Matt had been watching from near the equipment table. They had spent the competition side by side, saying little, watching Duncan shoot with the concentration of people who were quietly revising something they thought they understood. At some point during the third relay, Aaron had stopped keeping his own score. When the awards were finished and the range was beginning to quiet, Aaron approached. Matt came with him. They stood in front of Duncan without the bravado they'd had that morning, and without the aggressive apology that sometimes replaces it. Just 2 young men, standing in front of something larger than they'd anticipated. "We'd like to buy you dinner," Aaron said. "If you're willing, and if you have time, we'd appreciate anything you're prepared to share. We know we don't deserve it." Duncan looked at them both, the long, unhurried look. "I've got dinner with my sister," he said, "but I've got time now." He glanced around the range. "Find some paper, bring your rifles." What happened in the next 45 minutes? The tutorial Duncan Laird conducted on 2 collapsible chairs near the equipment bench was described by Constance Webb in her write-up for the club newsletter, and her account is still the most accurate. He didn't tell them what they were doing wrong. He asked questions until they figured it out themselves, and then he showed them what right looked like, and the difference was immediately visible to everyone watching. Aaron's trigger press was corrected inside 20 minutes. The anticipation problem, the one Duncan had spotted from 40 meters away, dissolved once Aaron understood the mechanics of why it was happening. His next 5 shots were the tightest group he'd produced in 3 years of competition. He stared at the target. He looked at Duncan. He didn't say anything, which was the right instinct. Some things you keep. Before Duncan left, Ted Birchall came to him with a request that had been forming since about halfway through the competition. "The Lee Enfield you repaired this morning," Ted said. "We'd like to keep it. With your permission, we'd like to mount it in the range office with a small plaque." Duncan considered this. "That rifle belongs to the club." "It does. We'd just like to note what happened." "Don't make it about me," Duncan said. "Make it about what it means." He thought for a moment. "Something simple. Skill doesn't require an audience. Something like that." Ted wrote it down. The story spread through the Canadian shooting community the way such things do, through club newsletters and range conversations, through the online forums where serious competitors trade range reports and technique notes, through the informal telegraph of retired military personnel who keep in touch across the country's distances. It reached the Canadian Forces marksmanship community. It reached, eventually, a journalist at a military publication in Ottawa who made several calls and confirmed what she could of the record, the decorations, the manual. All of it checking out, all of it more than she'd expected to find. She called the number she'd been given for Duncan Laird in Carleton Place. He picked up on the 3rd ring. She introduced herself, said she'd been hearing about what happened at the Rideau Valley range, said she'd like to write a piece about him. There was a pause. "I fixed a rifle," Duncan said. "Someone else made it a story." She told him she thought it was worth telling, that people should know who he was and what he represented. Another pause. "The kids at that range know something they didn't know before," Duncan said. "That's what matters, not what I did 30 years ago, what they do tomorrow. A beat. Write about them." He thanked her politely and hung up. That evening, his sister set dinner on the table in Carleton Place and asked how his day had been. He said he'd driven past a shooting range and stopped for a while. She asked if he'd had a good time. He thought about Aaron Fitch's target, pinned at 200 meters in the October wind. 5 rounds, the tightest group the young man had ever shot. "Yeah," Duncan Laird said, "it was a good day." The Lee Enfield went up on the wall of the range office the following week, cleaned and lightly oiled, mounted on a simple oak bracket. Below it, on a small brass plate, Ted had it engraved exactly as Duncan suggested. No name, no date, no explanation. Just the words that the old man in the green jacket had offered on his way out the door, the same way he'd offered everything else that day, quietly, without asking for anything in return. Skill doesn't require an audience.